Wuthering Waves is my favorite gacha game. Its conflict, it's also my biggest recurring complaint about the story. So, when a comment under my last video argued that same conflict feels static because it's only running one main thread, and the fix is to add more, of course I paid attention. I've made that same case myself before, only this time, part of it didn't hold up. Pritam's argument is that WuWa's main conflict, stopping the Lament, isn't actually the issue, and honestly, I think they're right about that part. Long-running stories keep their destination fixed all the time. Just like Pritam said in their comment, One Piece has been chasing Loftail for over 1,000 chapters. Nobody calls that stale. The goal staying still isn't the problem. Their actual argument is that WuWa only has one conflict operating at that top level, one main thread everything routes back into. And their fix is add more. Run several main level conflicts in parallel. The way a story like One Piece juggles the world government, the Void Century, and dozen personal arcs all moving independently. And look, I made a version of that argument myself before, so when I read it, my first reaction was just, yeah, that tracks. But it's not like Wuthering Waves is short on material here. Think about what's actually sitting in this world already. Fractsidus, the Threnodians, two forces that could absolutely function as major independent conflicts in their own right. The pieces are already on the board. So maybe the problem isn't that we need more conflicts, maybe the problem is we're not using the ones we already have. Start with Fractsidus. There's nothing thin about this faction. The lore is dense, the mystery is genuinely well built. If you go digging, there's a lot going on underneath. That's exactly what worries me. Because all of it stays underneath. Every time Fractsidus actually shows up in the moving story, not the lore entries, the actual scenes we play through, they're the mastermind who's already 10 steps ahead. They do something, we arrive, they vanish through a portal, and then we wait. That's not nothing, but after 2 years, that pattern stops feeling like mystery and starts feeling like absence. Fractsidus has become the one immovable piece on a board that's supposed to keep changing, and when your primary antagonistic force stops participating in forward momentum, the momentum has nowhere else to come from except the original stories, which, don't get me wrong, are genuinely great, but the story can't run on side conflicts alone forever. Now, the Threnodians are a different problem, almost the opposite one. These are supposed to be cosmic, world-ending beings, and I don't think I've ever actually felt that. Not because the story doesn't tell me, it tells me constantly, but every time a Threnodian actually enters the active story, they get folded into Fractsidus' plan almost immediately. They stop being their own threat and start being a tool somebody else is using, which means we've got one force that's dangerous but absent, and one force that's present but subordinate. Neither one is allowed to just be the conflict on its own terms in the scenes we're actually playing. And here's what's been nagging at me the most. We're in Mengzo right now, specifically looking for clues about the Grand Architect. That's the setup. That's supposedly the point of being here. So, genuine question, by the time this region wraps up, where do you actually think we'll be with that thread? Because my honest guess is, nowhere. Some vague clue, another layer of mystery stacked on top of the mystery we already have. And I don't think we need more mystery right now. I think we need less of it sitting in the background and more of it actually showing up. Here's the thing though. We've seen this work once really well, Septimont, specifically Lupa's storyline, because if you go back and actually track that arc from start to finish, something is different about how it's built. There's this whole layered mystery, the double world, what's actually happening to Lupa, what's real and what isn't, and it does something WuWa almost never does, it resolves inside its own arc. Not, here's a piece of the puzzle, wait 2 years for the next one. The mystery opens, it escalates, and by the end of that storyline, you actually understand what happened, which sounds like it should be normal. In this game, it's almost a novelty, and the reason it works isn't just pacing, it's Cristoforo. Because for that entire arc, Cristoforo isn't hiding behind a portal waiting for a cutscene. Well, Technically, he is, but he's also actively writing the story of Septimont in real time. Every twist in that mystery, every turn Lupa's situation takes, that's him doing it in front of us. That's the most active I've seen a Fractsidus antagonist be in this entire game. But, and I'm gonna hold my ground on this no matter what everyone else says, Cristoforo isn't even the best example from Septimont. Yuno is. And look, as much as I can't stand this guy, as much as I think he's kind of a terrible writer within his own story, he was a genuinely great antagonist during that arc. Those two things can both be true. Anyway, Yuno. I know some of you are going to disagree with me on this, because there was real discourse when her episode came out. It was introduced as part of the main story, not set aside as something optional. And a lot of people at the time thought that was the wrong call, that it should have been separated out, kept apart from the core narrative. I disagreed then, I still disagree now, because keeping her episode inside the main story was exactly the right choice. It needed to be there, front and center, as a direct consequence. Everyone forgetting her isn't some side detail you stumble onto if you go looking, it's the price paid for beating the boss, sitting right in the middle of the story where you can't avoid it. The complexity of that storyline doesn't live in some lore entry you have to go dig up, it lives in her, in what it costs her, specifically as a character, to be forgotten by everyone she loves. And it lives there in the main story where every player actually has to sit with it. That's the thing Fractsidus never does. The Threnodians don't do it either. Yuno's episode takes something that could have just been an abstract cost of victory and puts it inside one person where you actually have to sit with it. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you Septimont is flawless, because it isn't. I still wish we've gotten to see more of what came after Yuno's episode. Nobody regains their memory of her. We never really see how her relationships, her life, actually continue from there. That thread just kind of stops. And the ending of the arc as a whole, Galbrena getting introduced in the final episode, suddenly pulling this massive amount of focus away from the protagonists we've been following. That felt rushed. Some of it landed, some of it really didn't. So no, Septimont isn't perfect, but it's the closest this game has ever come to solving the exact problem we've been talking about. And once you see why it works, the actual issue with the rest of the game becomes really clear. It's not that Fractsidus and the Threnodians lack complexity, it's that all of that complexity lives in the lore, in the background, in the mystery you have to go read about instead of the story you're actually playing through. And that's fine, usually, that's what world building is for. But when that background layer is where almost all your complexity lives and your active antagonistic forces barely show up in the foreground, the story stops moving, not because it lacks ideas, but because none of those ideas are ever allowed to actually participate. Honestly, I didn't expect this video to end up here. I've been writing web novel for almost a decade now, but I'm about to self-publish my first actual book series, and it has a background antagonistic organization too. So the second I landed on complexity that stays in the background is the problem, I had this moment of, wait, am I about to make the exact same mistake? I had to actually stop and check. Here's the honest version. In my first book, that organization tries to kidnap a group of children, and for most of the book afterward, they're barely present. They're not actively hunting my protagonist through most of the story, which on the surface sounds like exactly what I just spent 2 acts criticizing. But then I looked at what that one action actually does. It doesn't just start the plot and disappear, it permanently changes the reality my protagonist is living in. He and one of the kidnapped children get dropped onto the surface world, a place filled with mythological monsters, actual danger, immediate survival stakes. The organization isn't hunting him, but something is. Every day he's down there, he's not safe. The threat isn't abstract, it's not a cloud in the sky waiting for a cutscene, it's right there. That's different from Fractsidus vanishing through a portal. My antagonists aren't stalling the story by staying mysterious, they kicked over a set of dominoes, and the entire rest of the book is what happens as those dominoes fall. And then there's book 2. By now my protagonist actually knows where to find them. There's a base out there, a real physical place tied to that organization, and in book 2 he goes after it. Now, going after that base isn't even the main conflict of that book, that's something else entirely, something I'm not getting into here. Destroying that base is more of a side move, but it's not a small one, because he doesn't just do it for revenge, he does it knowing it paints a target on his back. He's deliberately provoking them into actively hunting him. That's the part I think matters most, because that gives me an organic back and forth. The antagonists aren't just something my protagonist reacts to, and they're not something that reacts to him either. Not really. He forces the exchange into existence himself, he picks the fight before they're ready to bring it to him. And that's the piece I don't think Wuthering Waves ever lets happen. For whatever reason, the writers never really let Rover force Fractsidus' hand. Rover doesn't get to provoke them, corner them, make them respond on someone else's timeline. It's always the other way. Fractsidus moves and everyone else reacts. The story is still waiting on the antagonist to act. Mine works the other way around. The protagonist is the one setting the pace. That's actually the core of it, I think, the real difference between my story and Wuthering Waves' story. In my story, the driving force is always the protagonist and the people around him. They're at the forefront every time. In Wuthering Waves, the driving force is supposed to be Fractsidus and the Threnodians. That's who's meant to be pushing the story forward, but they're not at the forefront nearly as much as they need to be, given that job. Not never, but not enough. It's not really about background versus foreground or how mysterious a faction gets to stay. It's about who's actually driving. If your antagonists are supposed to be the engine of the story, they need to show up like one. If they can't, the story needs someone else pulling that weight, and right now, Wuthering Waves only really has that in its regional arcs, not in the main conflict itself. Look, I haven't cracked this perfectly, I haven't even published the first book yet. I could be wrong about plenty of this once it's actually out in the world and being read by people who aren't me, but I think that's a more precise question than add more main conflicts. It's about who's actually in the driver's seat. So, that's where I've landed, at least for now. Wuthering Waves has every piece it needs already sitting on the table. Fractsidus, the Threnodians, all of it. The problem was never a shortage of ideas, it's that almost none of those ideas are ever let out of the background. Septimont proved it's possible. Cristoforo showed what active antagonism actually looks like, and you know, she's the proof that consequence hits harder when it lives in a person instead of a lore entry. Now I just want to see them do it again, on purpose, not as an accident of one really good regional arc. So, I'll turn it back to you. Who do you think should actually be driving Wuthering Waves' main conflict? Should Fractsidus and the Threnodians finally start pushing the story forward themselves? Or is it time for Rover to start forcing their hand? Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more story discussions like this one. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.